There are more so-called imams and scholars of Islam today than there has ever been in the history of Islam. Today, there are more Muslims existing on the face of the earth than there ever has been in the history of Islam. There's almost like 2 billion Muslims. Now, what has that done or benefited anybody in anything? What has that done for the state of Islam today? Nothing. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد إلهم والمهدينا وسلم تسليما السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My dear brother and companion and friend on this path, Waqar.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my Lord, and the kind from the family of Muhammad, from you is peace.
God bless you, Waqar.
Thank you, my Lord.
Today we're going to talk about a very important narration, continuing on in the same line and pattern in which we have been speaking over the past several episodes, where we are examining the different sunnahs that are mentioned in the narrations that exist in the Qa'im, that parallel sunnahs that happened with previous prophets and messengers. And that is because we have this large group of narrations from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that can be broken down into two parts. One group of narrations basically state that in the Qa'im there are sunnahs from the previous prophets and messengers. One narration actually says that with the Qa'im, there are the sunnahs of all of the prophets and the messengers, which means that basically these stories and narrations, these events that took place with Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, Abraham, Adam, Joseph, Jonah, Saleh, all of these stories were preserved because they will repeat itself. Nothing is new under the sun. History repeats itself, and that's why, we mentioned that there is this narration in previous episodes that said that the Muslims will follow the sunnahs of those who come before them, step by step, so much so that if they were to fall into the lizard's hole, we would do the same thing, meaning the nation of Islam would follow that sunnah of the previous nations, and the divinely appointed imam or the qa'im will have with him the sunnahs of the previous prophets and messengers. The second group of narrations state that basically, at some point, the Qa'im is going to revive, bring life to, resurrect the jurisprudences of the previous prophets and messengers. And so he works by and implements at some point the jurisprudence of Adam. And the people object to that. And he implements the jurisprudence of Abraham and that of Moses and that of Jesus, the Sharia, right? The laws. And then at some point, he goes and works by the laws of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so there's this parallel that's drawn in the narrations that the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam emphasized on, and we have to examine that in order that we take heed to their advice, and also that the believers may know what to expect in that time. If people only contemplated as they were commanded to in the Holy Quran, contemplated and thought over the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, it would save them a lot of trouble. And so we spoke about the sunnah that repeats itself from the dawah of Noah and some of the other prophets. And now we will speak about today the sunnah that repeats itself with the Qa'im from Abraham alayhi salam. So the narrations state that in the Qa'im is a sunnah from Abraham. And then it breaks it down and says that, and it is the fact that his birth is hidden, as well as the fact that he secludes himself from the people. And in order to draw the parallels and see what happens in the dawah of the Qa'im and with him, we have to examine the story of Abraham. So let's examine it, shall we?
Yes, Father.
Abraham, according to the narrations, according to the Bible, and there's also Gnostic texts or books that spoke about Abraham that are very ancient, including a book that he supposedly wrote with his own hand that was rejected and left out of the Bible. If we take all of these accounts from the Torah and from Christianity and from these Gnostic manuscripts, as well as the Quran and the narrations of Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, and we put it all together, it essentially tells the same story. And it is the story of a youth who is extremely intelligent and smart. He's a very bright man that thinks for himself and outside of the box. He's a free thinker, and he's not a worshiper of idols. And he instead of following blindly like the rest of the people in his age, he wants to know how and why. And so he is living with his father, and he also has an uncle. In some of the narrations, it is the father who is working as an idol maker, crafting idols out of wood and out of stone and selling it in Babylon to the people. And according to other accounts, it is the uncle of Abraham, who is the one who is making the idols. And this difference in account is usually attributed to the fact that there are these other narrations that state that a hujjah can only be born from a hujjah. So that if somebody was a divinely appointed person, that the father is supposed to be a divinely appointed person because of the verse in the Quran that says, the seed one from the other, right? And so they have attempted in some narrations to preserve that line of thinking and to correct history by stating that it was actually his uncle and not his physical father. Therefore, to be able to argue that Abraham's father was still a good man and not an idol worshiper, but it was the uncle who was an idol worshiper, and that the father of Abraham might have passed away at some point and he was raised by his uncle instead.
When I was a Shia, they would teach us that it was not his father, but it was his uncle. Because a father of a prophet cannot be like this.
Exactly.
So that's why they would say this is all distorted.
Exactly.
But now I understand it's actually the truth. It's not the case. He was actually his father.
This aspect of trying to argue that every single person who is a hujjah, their father had to have been a believer, is a false notion and concept, and it's just an assumption. And we have examples in history of individuals that were appointed as prophets and messengers while their fathers were not necessarily people who were hujjas, so to speak. And so you have Samuel, who appoints David after Saul fails to comply with God's commands, and the father of David was not necessarily a hujjah at that time. He was a righteous man, he was a good man, but he was not necessarily one of the 124,000 prophets and messengers that were sent in that time. Nonetheless, let's go back to the main point. So the story tells about this brilliant boy, and what happens. He is given the task by his uncle or by his father to take the idols and to go forward. and to sell them in the marketplace. As Abraham is taking the idols, according to one narration, one of them falls down and breaks. And when the idol falls down and breaks out of fear, one of the other people that was in the marketplace, who had come from a faraway land, said that he would like to buy that idol which fell down and broke, because it's not appropriate for an idol to be left in that state broken. So he wanted to buy it, and he also wanted to buy all the other idols of the same God. And so Abraham contemplated over this incident, and he thought to himself, how ignorant and foolish is this individual? He pays the money to buy an idol that my father had crafted with his own hands, all right, that can neither benefit nor harm anybody. It couldn't even help itself. It fell down and it shattered. It couldn't help itself, let alone help anybody else. And so this was the beginning of his thinking process. He never once worshipped an idol in his day, and he refused to carry on with participating in misleading people by selling idols of misguidance to the people. And so he comes up with a plan one day. During those times, there was the Kaaba, and the Kaaba was this cube that was constructed, and the narrations state that the very first person who had constructed this house was Adam alayhi salam, and that the house itself was reconstructed at a later time by Abraham and made as a house of worship only to God, or the one God. But the narrations state that at some point there was this Kaaba, whether it was the original one or not, or if it was a different house, there was this house that the people would come to, and it would be filled with a variety of different idols. Yeah. And so Abraham sneaks into there one day, and he has his axe with him, and he decides that he's going to free the people. He's going to free them from their ignorance by pulling a little bit of a trick, so to speak, right? Or pose a problem. He would make a riddle or a puzzle. He would basically checkmate his people into having to admit that they were upon misguidance, or having to admit that their idols are without power and weak. And so basically what he does is he takes the axe and he strikes down all of the idols. They shatter into 1,000 pieces, and then he places the axe into the hands of the great idol, the biggest idol that's there. Yes. And so the people wake up and they come to the house the next day. They look around, and what do they see? They see all these idols are shattered into 1,000 pieces, and they find this one idol that has an axe in its hand. And so they begin to ask the question, they begin to freak out. They begin to state, somebody broke in here and started destroying all of our idols. We have to find out who's responsible for this. So Abraham speaks up and he says, it's very clear who's responsible for that. The one idol that remains, that has the axe in his hand, he's clearly the one who destroyed all of the rest of the idols. It seems like last night they had a great battle when everybody was asleep, and the big idol decided that he was going to kill everybody, and he won. So there's only one God left. Look, is it not clear? And of course, the people, having heard that from Abraham and knowing that it is impossible that an idol made of wood or made of stone would actually move or do anything, they were forced to basically entertain that possibility, which they didn't believe in and they thought was impossible, or they had to admit that the idols actually cannot do anything.
It's very amusing to listen to this story, but within it is a powerful message.
It really is.
Because I remember when I listened to it as a child, it got me thinking as well. It forces the person to think his situation.
It does. And that's what Abraham did with his people. He forced them to think and to contemplate and to admit their own disbelief, to come face to face with the ridiculous nature of their belief system. Now, after that happened, obviously, the people began to blame Abraham for it. And the news spread throughout Babylon that there is this heretic that is destroying idols, and that's telling the people that the idols can neither benefit nor harm. And this caused great danger on Abraham's life, and Abraham had to withdraw himself from society. He had to seclude himself because of the dangers that were posed to his life, as well as the fact that he did not see himself as somebody who had anything in common with those simple-minded people that were worshiping idols. Okay? Yes. So, and then in the end, obviously, like, the incident takes place where he's arrested and he's brought forward and he's thrown into the fire, and his uncle or his father supports this decision, etc. That sunnah, the seclusion of Abraham from his people, was as a direct result of his disbelief in the idols and his existing within a society that was worshiping idols. And that is exactly what it is that Abraham's da'wah was focused on, and it was the core of his message, and it is exactly what it is that he was doing the entire time that he was preaching monotheism. He was destroying false idols and false gods that people were worshiping. And so when we have a parallel from Abraham occurring in the time of the Qa'im, then we have to assume that the seclusion of the Qa'im from his people is as a result of the fact that the Qa'im is moving forward and he's breaking idols that exist in this day and age. So the question becomes, but wait a minute, is it even possible? Are people still worshiping idols? The Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam stated very clearly, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi in one narration states very clearly that the hour will not come upon his people until there are tribes from the Muslims that go back to worshiping idols like they did in the beginning. And there's another narration from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that states that the Qa'im will actually have a more difficult time with his people and with his da'wah than the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi did in his time. Because the Prophet of Allah, the narration states, when he went to his people, they were worshiping idols that were made of sticks and stones, right? But in the time of the Qa'im, everybody will be using the Quran and arguing against him. And so there's this insinuation that is made that when the Prophet went out to his people, they were worshiping idols of sticks and stones. But when the Qa'im goes out to his people, the people will be using the Quran, hence they will be worshiping a different type of idol, right? An idol that is a Muslim idol, so to speak. And we have explicit narrations from Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, where you have Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, for example. He's speaking to one of his companions and he tells them that true guidance is only by doing two things: declaring oneself innocent from the enemies of Allah and His Messenger, as well as having the wilayah, taking as in authority, pledging allegiance to the rightly guided Imam from the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. And so the companion asks Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he says to him, and who are the enemies of Allah? And Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam responds and says, the four idols and anyone who is upon their religion. And then he clarifies that the four idols are Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Muawiyah. Okay, Ibn Abi Sufyan. And so here in that narration, it is extremely clear that the idols after Islam still exist, right? And that the Arabs continue to worship and take as idols. Each tribe or each people of the Muslims will continue to worship idols, but it's not the type of idols that existed before Islam, which were just sticks and stones, but there was an evolution that takes place in the polytheism that the Muslims and the Arabs were upon. The idols that were rejected by Abraham and by the nation of Islam, which were idols that did not speak and did not talk, got replaced with idols that now can walk and can talk and can speak, right? So they missed the whole point, and they replaced that which cannot speak with that which can speak, but they continued to worship them and commit polytheism. Another narration from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam specifically interprets a verse from the Quran in which it states that the people took their priests and their rabbis as gods besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so somebody was saying, wow, I've never seen that to be the case, that a group of Christians or a group of Jews worship their rabbis or worship their priests. So how is it the case that they took their rabbis and their priests as gods, right? Besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and worship them? And so the Imam from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam clarified that the rabbis and the priests, they made haram the halal, they made permissible the impermissible, and they made impermissible the permissible. They made halal the haram, and the haram, they turned it into halal. And the people obeyed them in that and took by their opinion. They were scholars, priests, rabbis that were not enforced by the Holy Spirit. They were not appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were not prophets and messengers of the time or imams. And yet the people followed them in their opinions in regards to religion, and those people led them astray. And so by the fact that you obeyed them, you worshipped them. And the Imam clarified in other narrations that the meaning of worship is to obey, that there are only two types of speakers: a speaker who speaks on behalf of truth and on behalf of the light, on behalf of what's right. So when somebody talks, they're only going to say something which is either true or something which is false. Anytime somebody is saying something which is true, they are speaking on behalf, right, of the source of truth. So those who obey the speaker in his truth are actually obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And therefore, by obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they have worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet, the person whom speaks the untruth, if the people follow him, then they're following the untruth which that person has spoken, and thus they have worshipped him and worshipped the source of that lie, and that is the devil, lanatullah alayh.
But the people, they think that worship is the person prostrates or prays to a person. A lot of people never understood before that by just listening and obeying someone, you are actually worshipping him.
Exactly, and that's why the Imam says in the narration where he's explaining the verse, he says that by Allah, if these priests and rabbis would have claimed godhood or asked, right, the people to worship them, nobody would have worshipped them.
Yeah, no one would.
So the verse says what? The verse says that they took the rabbis and priests as gods without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, besides God, right? They worshipped them.
Yes.
The Imam is saying that it is impossible that any group of Christians or Jews would have ever worshipped a priest or a rabbi. So there's another meaning behind it.
Yes.
And the meaning behind it was the fact that they were scholars of misguidance. They led the people astray, and thus they were called idols, because they were somebody or something that was other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that caused the people to go astray, and that caused the people to worship it through the obedience of its commands. Other narrations from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam have, declared that certain scholars, such as Abu Hanifa and others, basically the Imams from the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam, referred to them as idols that were leading people astray. And so now we know that the meaning of idols is actually scholars,
Yes.
people that are speaking in terms of religion. In some cases, it's also referring to political leaders, mainly to scholars, but sometimes to political leaders, because you have, in the case of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Muawiyah, political leaders, caliphs, whom are also assuming the chair of the supreme authority in regards to religion. They're claiming themselves to be the vicegerents or the successors of the Prophet of Allah. They're claiming themselves to be the princes of the believers. And for that reason, they are idols because they're misguiding people.
So they've basically usurped these positions.
They basically usurped these positions. And we also have examples of people like this that exist today, that are sitting on chairs of authority and that are basically assuming the highest office in terms of political power, and also the highest office in terms of religious authority. One of those figures is Ayatollah Khamenei. All right, and anybody who sits in that office, as well as the person who was before him, Khomeini, right, who established the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran. You have also in Sunni countries people like Mohammed ibn Salman, who is the highest authority in terms of the political power, but he is in charge of, like most of the Arab countries, the ministries of religion, all right, that and so he has the final say in terms of the religion that is being preached to the masses. And so any one of these Muslim leaders could be called an idol, as well as the scholars of misguidance that support them and call to them.
Perfectly clear.
Does that make sense?
Perfect sense.
Okay. So that's the environment that the Qa'im comes into. He comes into an environment that resembles very much the environment that existed in the time of Abraham. You have tyrant who's in power in the time of Abraham, who is overseeing a society that is worshiping idols, and it is through the worship of the idols that that tyrant is maintaining his power. You have in the time of the Qa'im tyrants who are sitting in the place of the Prophet of Allah over the Muslim nations, and they also are maintaining power through a group of idols that call people to obey them and to elect them and to worship them through the acceptance of their rulings.
So it's actually the people that have put these people into power by accepting their authority.
Absolutely. When I was in the United States, I had some interaction with the Islamic Society of North America. I had went to see what is going on in some of their conferences and their events and in their mosques. And what I found was taking place was that even though these societies, right, or the society was claiming to be an Islamic one, it was actually just a political tool that was used and uses its scholars to move the masses of Muslims that exist within the United States to elect certain political candidates, all right?
Yes.
So they would build mosques throughout the country. And the Islamic Society of North America would have a hand in appointing the imams of these mosques, right? And the preachers that would be over these particular areas. And if they didn't build the mosques themselves or pick the imam of the mosque itself, they would seek to establish relations and gather and unite all of the different mosques throughout the countries and all the different imams and influence those institutions by having these yearly events and having these youth camps where it would be open to all Muslims around the country. And they would essentially at these conferences have lectures where they would have the different scholars from around the country speak, all right? And it would be free for the Muslims to come and listen to these different scholars. And they would have these activities that would be going on. And then in the midst of the speakers, they would bring up a politician who was running for office, right? Or running for the presidency or whatever it is, or Congress. And they would give him the opportunity to speak to the people, and then the imams and those who were responsible in the Islamic society would push the Muslims to vote for and elect these particular candidates, right? And they would claim that, this one is the one who's the most Muslim friendly and he's going to do good things for the Muslims, and that we have to, elect them. And that's pretty much like a pledge of allegiance that we're doing. And so when the Muslims accept the words of the scholars, right? We said previously, then they're worshiping them, right?
Yes.
And if it is a command that is from God, then it is worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes. But if it's a command from the devil, then it is worship of the devil. And for sure, we don't have any evidence whatsoever that Muhammad and the family of Muhammad would require us to pledge allegiance to somebody who's not appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let alone somebody who's not a Muslim at all. Let alone somebody who's actually overseeing and funding wars against the Muslims themselves in Iraq and Palestine and Sudan and operations in Libya and almost every single Arab country. There are covert operations that are taking place. But yet the scholars of misguidance command the people that they have to go and they have to elect these individuals. And so by doing so, they are pledging allegiance to these individuals, and they are swearing themselves as supporters to these individuals, and they are required thus to obey these individuals, and they take upon their shoulders the response they take upon they share with these people that they elect all of the good that they do, but also all of the bad that they do. And they stain themselves with blood, because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that whoever, if somebody kills somebody in the East and somebody in the West is pleased with that, just feels happy upon that, then he is a partner in that crime. So what about somebody who kills somebody in the East and you're in the West and you have actually empowered that person? You helped pay for that person to have the weapons whereby he committed the crime that he did, as well as the fact that you voiced support for and helped him ascend to the throne. And so that unfortunately is where the scholars of misguidance have led the people today. In the Middle East, they're doing the same thing. They're preaching that you must elect the tyrant of the time. In Egypt, the scholars will go out and they will tell the people that they have to vote for, Sisi. In other countries, the scholars will tell the people that if they don't pledge allegiance to Muhammad ibn Salman or to the king of Morocco or to the authority figure that is in their country, then they're actually disobeying the Quran, because the Quran says that you have to obey Allah and obey His Messenger and obey those who have command amongst you. Even though that verse, according to the Ahl Bayt, is referring to the divinely appointed imams, these scholars of misguidance twist the meaning of the verse and apply it to any tyrant who is in power, even if they're against Islam or against the people or doing corruption or great injustices. They force the people through religious pressure to do that. And so in the time of the Qa'im, the only solution for this is that he begins a revolution. First, it's an intellectual revolution, awareness, so whereby he preaches against the idols of misguidance, and he shows everybody that they can never attain true freedom from the tyrant until they free themselves first from the worship of the idol. Right?
Yes.
And so Abraham could never, and the Babylonians would never be free of Nimrod until first they were free from the idol worship. And once they free themselves from the idol worship, God is with them. Even if the tyrant throws them into the fire like he did with Abraham, it would be cool and calm and it won't affect them because God is with them. And so you cannot be against the tyrant and you cannot be against Nimrod and be with Abraham unless you first follow Abraham in to cease worshiping the idols that do not benefit nor do they harm. And that's what we find today. We find that the Muslims are plagued with idols that can neither benefit nor harm. These scholars, like the idols in the time of Abraham, they can't even save themselves from the hellfire. In fact, they are the first people that are going to hellfire, and they do not cause any sort of benefit for the Muslim nation. They are on the pulpits and they're preaching, but it's not changing anything. Poverty still remains in the Muslim lands. Wars are still taking place. The Muslims are still oppressed. The mosques are as numerous as it has ever been before in history. In history today, there are more mosques than there has ever been all over the world. There are more so-called imams and scholars of Islam today than there has ever been in the history of Islam. Today, there are more Muslims existing on the face of the earth than there ever has been in the history of Islam. There's almost like 2 billion Muslims. What has that done or benefited anybody in anything? What has that done for the state of Islam today? Nothing. Because those the 2 billion Muslims are all worshiping idols, and they're not really worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those idols are misguiding people. You have people that are worshiping this scholar or that scholar, or doing by his opinion or doing by that one's opinion. When in reality they should be breaking free from that and finding the Imam of their time, because the Prophet said that in every day and age there is an Abraham, and whoever dies and does not know the Imam of his time has died the death of ignorance. So the people are required to find Abraham in this day and age, and the Qa'im is that Abraham in that time, and he is the one whom leads this call. And the call focuses a lot on freeing the people from these idols. And so we need a revolution. We need a revolution where we delete all of the idols of misguidance, that people turn against the scholars and they refuse to listen to them in anything. And that is the only way that Islam will be fixed. The narrations concerning the scholars, we've mentioned it many times in many episodes, they are frightening, Waqar, because they state that the Prophet himself was terrified over the Muslim nation from misguidance. And he tells them on many occasions occasions, him and the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, that they fear for the Muslim nation, that they get led astray by something that's more dangerous than the armies of Yazid, that's more dangerous than the Antichrist Dajjal himself, and that is the scholars of misguidance. Right?
Yes.
And we also have other narrations that state that in the end times, the mosques would be glamorous, but they would be free of guidance. Well, if they're free of guidance and they always have a scholar that's in them, that means that the scholars themselves are empty of any sort of guidance, that they're useless, that they're idols, that we're worshiping for no reason. Other narrations from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam have described the scholars of the end times as being the most filthy thing underneath the sky. And that from them the fitna emerges and to them it returns. And so these scholars that are standing by, and we see it right now, look at what's happening. There's a genocide that's taking place against Muslims, and nobody's speaking out about it. In fact, they arrest you if you do speak out about it, and they place you in jail. During the Iraq War, during the war in Libya, during every war, during every event of misfortune and oppression against the Muslim leaders do nothing, and the scholars of misguidance do nothing, because these false scholars are asking the people to do the opposite of something, and that is nothing. They're telling them that they need to be quiet, that they need to go to bed, that they need to support the tyrant, that they need not involve themselves in matters of politics because they don't know any better. They are a drug. They are a sleeping pill for the masses. They are something that is of the devil.
Yes. So basically, they've turned the religion of Muhammad, peace be upon him, into a religion that was a religion of action, into a religion of inaction.
Exactly.
Which benefits nobody.
And so it is those idols, and for that reason that you find them being mentioned in the narrations as being the prime enemies of the Qa'im when he emerges, and they're the ones that, and that's why you have them in narrations that stating that, during the events of the rise, that the Qa'im kills 16,000 of them in Iraq, and that the Qa'im has no greater enemy than the scholars of misguidance, etc. And so, we'll stop there, and we'll leave the people to reflect upon the fact that these idols are existing today, and we leave them with that choice, and the choice is clear, and that is to continue to worship idols of misguidance, or to join Abraham and his revolution against Nimrod and against the idols of this day and age.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
dear Father, for making this so clear to me and everybody else that's watching this. And I bear witness that you are the only man on the face of the earth that is the man of action.
God bless you.
And you say what you do, and God is with you. And I have witnessed many times miracles that enforce that God is with you all the time.
God bless you.
And what comes out of your mouth is nothing but inspiration.
Thank you so much.
So peace is from you and upon you, my Lord.
God bless you.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, and peace be upon you too. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.